Well, it's certainly the best of times and the worst of times in the tale of Australia's two-speed economy. As we just heard, extraordinary fortunes are being made in the resources game, with BHP Billiton posting a record $22 billion profit. A few days earlier, BHP's old steel-making division, BlueScope Steel, suffered the toughest day of its 11-year history when it announced it will close its export business and slash 1,000 jobs on the back of a $1 billion loss this year. It highlights the awful bind manufacturers find themselves in as the high dollar and rising commodity prices put the squeeze on their ability to compete and survive. Stephen Letts reports.
Long before BlueScope Steel decided to shut down its export operations, and even before the resources boom, the soaring Australian dollar and declining productivity were blamed for hollowing out Australia's industrial heartland. The long march out of the factories had begun. Back in the 70s, manufacturing accounted for almost 20% of the economy. Today, it's less than 10%, and that wasting away is now only likely to accelerate.
Some manufacturers are approaching tipping point in terms of their competitiveness.
If we continue down the path we're going with no adequate policy responses, I don't think it'll exist. And that's sad, and that's going to create huge problems.
I think it just shrivels away. I think that it's always going to be easier to buy something in a box, in a cardboard box from China, and you just unload it and sell it.
The surveys basically say what's happening is the weak are getting weaker.
The NAB's chief economist, Alan Oster, runs the nation's longest-running and most respected business survey that's tracked the fortunes of industry for the past turbulent couple of decades.
So we've already, to some extent, had an adjustment, but what you've got at present is very high currency, high interest rates, reasonably high wages compared to, say, China particularly, and therefore it just makes it very difficult. If you've got anything to do with scale, and let's face it, something like manufacturing of steel is scale, then it's very difficult to compete.
The factory I grew up in had 50 people in it, and we made everything. You know, we got steel in, all made in Port Kembla, and we formed it and welded it and machined it.
Anthony Kitchener is a third-generation manufacturer, just.
We used to have 50, now we've got 2, and mostly they do an assembly function.
He switched the family business from making labour-intensive high-end air compressors to wine cabinets.
Insulations from Saudi Arabia. These shelves are made in Preston, China, Brunswick. These rivets are made in China, tonneau lugs, which are made in Geelong. This comes from Italy, and this is the body of the cabinet, which we built here in Spotswood.
Rather than fight the flood of competition from offshore, Anthony Kitchener has had to develop a hybrid business model to keep making anything at all.
What we worked out was that some of the products that we were making here were particularly suited to Australian conditions, so we made larger cabinets that went in garages that stored 500 bottles, and then in the smaller part of the range where people wanted cabinets that went inside with glass doors, we couldn't compete on those, so we import those from China. So we're sort of 50% fully imported and 50% local manufacture.
We need to do everything we can to maintain manufacturing capacity in our country, because it's not just the factory that produces that's an important part of the economy, it's the supply lines that service those factories, the component suppliers, the jobs of contractors in related industries. So manufacturing employment is labour intensive, it's also part of a more integrated economic structure.
Paul Howes is the National Secretary of the Australian Workers' Union and argues taxing the resources boom is the best policy option.
Brazil's a good example of putting different levels of taxation on this investment to put downward pressure on their currency, but also to ensure that when the resource boom finishes, that there will be long-lasting industries in other sectors, such as manufacturing there, to make sure that we're not just putting all of our eggs into one basket.
What you've got to do is you've got to bring everybody along with you. So there will be disruption in the short term, and so therefore you've got to minimise the disruption. And that's to some extent why economists talk about, you know, the need to improve your productivity, to make everything more flexible, and also to use some income that you've got to essentially support the areas that are under stress. Now, to me, a resource rent tax is that.
Peter Anderson is the head of the largest employer group, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and has a slightly different policy wish list.
The first thing is the government should do no damage, and the introduction of a carbon tax, it definitely undermines the competitiveness of the manufacturing industry. We can't and don't want to compete with Asia on lower wages, so that means we need to make every other post a winner.
And for manufacturers, there's little point hoping a falling dollar will be a salvation. Policymakers aren't about to intervene, and the commodity boom shows no sign of ending just yet.
It's irreversible, and what I really wouldn't like to see the dollar at 80 cents tomorrow, because if that's the case, then the world economy's probably fallen over. So that would absolutely kill demand.
If we are going to be simply a resource-driven economy, what happens when we hit the bottom of the quarry? What happens when the boom busts? What type of economy will be left in Australia?
And without a significant change in direction, the answer for the nation's industrial base looks increasingly bleak.